We've been doing this series of sermons on different enemies for a while now, and today is the last one. Today we're going to talk about the last big enemy, the Babylonians. And they really are like the last big bad guy at the end of a book or a movie or a video game. The Babylonians were the biggest, strongest enemy that the children of Israel had ever faced, and the evil that the Babylonians represent, in many ways, is the biggest and strongest evil that any of us will ever have to deal with. And so today, first we're going to talk about what the Babylonians mean in our lives. Then we'll look at a couple of stories about them to get a feel for what the Babylonians are like and how they operate. And last, we'll talk about how to watch for the influence of Babylon in our lives and how the Lord can help to keep us safe from them. So, what do they represent? The lesson we read from the teachings of the new church said that Babylon means everyone who wants to use religion to control others. So there's two parts of that: wanting to control people and using things of religion as the means to that end. Here's a passage that spells out a little bit more how that works. The worst kind of self-love is the love of dominion over others for selfish reasons. That is, the love of possessing dominion solely for the sake of position and gain. Those in whom that love predominates may, it is true, make professions of faith and charity, but they do so with their lips and not with their heart. Indeed, the worst among them look on the things that belong to faith and charity, thus to the holy things of the church, as the means to their own ends. So, the people meant by Babylon might appear outwardly very religious, the most religious people you've met. They know all the quotes, they know all the teachings, but they're just using those religious things as a tool for controlling people for their own selfish reasons. Now, did you notice that that passage said that this is the worst kind of self-love? Here are some other superlatives that the teachings of the new church say about this love. Emanuel Swedenborg, who the Lord called to write the teachings of the new church down, he says this about love of dominion or love of ruling for selfish reasons. When I considered the love of governing stemming from a love of self, I was given to see that this love was supremely hellish, and so is found among those who are in the deepest hell. Another passage says this: the most difficult battle of all is with the love of ruling from a love of self. One who overcomes this love easily overcomes all other evil loves because it is their head. So this is the big battle that we're going to have to face at some point. And another passage talks about part of why it's so hard to fight against this love is because of how good it feels to give in to it. Swedenborg was allowed to experience the delight of this love, and listen to how he describes it. I have been given to feel the nature and extent of the delight of a love of ruling from a love of self. I was conveyed into it in order to experience it, and it was such as to exceed all other delights that exist in the world. It was a delight of the whole mind, from its inmost constituents to its outmost ones, while in the body it felt altogether as a pleasure and enjoyment swelling the breast. I was also given to sense as well that from that delight, as though from their fountainhead, gushed the delights of all other evils, such as those of adultery, taking vengeance, cheating, slandering, of doing evil in general. So, controlling other people for your own selfish reasons feels overwhelmingly good. It just feels great in your mind, it feels great in your whole body, and it leads to all sorts of other delightful things, like hurting people, committing adultery, all those lovely delights of hell. And this is why, in the book of Revelation, Babylon is depicted as a harlot that commits harlotry with the kings of the earth, and who gets the nations drunk. And it's also why it says that the merchants of the earth have become rich from the power of her delights. Babylon offers some powerful, intoxicating, hellish delights. Can you see why the Babylonians are the big final bad guy? So now let's get a better picture of what this evil love is like by looking at some of the stories about the Babylonians. And the first story, as you may well know, is the story of the Tower of Babel from the book of Genesis. The people building that tower say, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower, and its head in the heavens, and let us make for ourselves a name, lest perhaps we be scattered on the faces of all the earth." They want to build up and up and up and up until they're in the heavens, and that's a picture of how a love of ruling from the love of self just wants more power and more power and more power, all the way up to wanting power over heaven and eventually power over God. And we can see the same motivation described in what the prophet Isaiah says about the king of Babylon. He says, "You have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." Now, if you met somebody who said, "I want to control everyone and everything," it would be pretty easy to say that person is crazy and they should not be in charge of anything. But unfortunately, sometimes the Babylonians seem helpful. They're going to help you out. They're going to help you get done what you need to get done. It's going to be good. In the story of Hezekiah and the Babylonians that we read in our lessons, Hezekiah had been very sick, and the son of the king of Babylon sent him letters and a gift offering. How kind, how sympathetic. And do you remember what Hezekiah then did? He showed the son of the king of Babylon all the treasures in his house, and probably in the temple too. And so the prophet Isaiah told Hezekiah that the king of Babylon would be back and would eventually come and take possession of all his treasures and some of his sons and all the people. That was what was coming. And this is a picture of how, if we let it, the selfish desire for control will come into our hearts from hell and look around for all the good religious treasures that we have, the religious knowledge that we have, and we'll use that as a tool to try to control other people. And unfortunately, there are endless examples of this in the history of the human race. People who would say things like, "We are the ones who understand the truth, and so we will tell you what the word says. You are not smart enough to read it for yourselves. We will tell you what it says. And the word says that we get to decide who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. And if you don't give us money and do what we say exactly, we're going to send you to hell and your whole family too." Now, that set of teachings there might remind you of some of the teachings and practices of the Catholic Church from a couple of hundred years ago. And you might know that the teachings of the new church do say that Babylon represents the corrupt Catholic Church, particularly Babylon in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation. Something that you might not know that I learned this week is that interpreting Babylon in the book of Revelation as a symbol of the Catholic Church is not unique to the teachings of the new church. It was a fairly common Protestant interpretation. One passage from the teachings of the new church says, "It is well known that the present-day Babylon exists among the Roman Catholics." But while many Protestants at the time when the teachings of the new church were written would have painted with a broad brush and said all Catholics were the whore of Babylon, what the teachings of the new church actually say is both narrower and also broader. It's narrower in the sense that the teachings of the new church make clear that the Babylonians in the Catholic Church were the corrupt, controlling, abusive leaders, but that many of the people were still good people. One passage, for example, says this: "The church, despite the quality of its leadership, did survive among its subject people. All the people of that religion who turn to the Lord and abstain from evils as sins are saved. So they make up many heavenly communities in the spiritual world." And the New Church interpretation of the Babylonians is also broader than the typical Protestant interpretation, in that the teachings would say that someone from any faith background, from any point in history, could be a spiritual Babylonian. As the passage in our lesson said, Babylon means everyone who wants to use religion to control others. And there are, of course, many, many non-Catholic pastors, church leaders, just individuals who've gotten caught up in using religion as a tool to control other people. And they've caused tremendous harm in their families, in their communities, in the world. So, you can see now how terrible it is to use religious things to control other people. Can you also see how tempting it is to use religious things to get what you want? Imagine just being in an argument with someone and that you could use something from the word to make them feel a little bit guilty and then decide to do things the way you want to. It would be hard to not use that little bit of leverage, right? But we need to not let the Babylonians see our treasures. When we're trying to figure out how to get what we want, we need to stay away from the religious things that we might want to use to our advantage. When the prophet Isaiah questioned Hezekiah about what the Babylonians had said to him and where they came from, Hezekiah said that they came from a far-off land. And it could seem like a far-off possibility that we would use religious things to get what we want. That would never happen. I'm a good person. But now let's shift into talking about how the Lord can keep us safe from the Babylonians. And a good general principle for this is we should expect the Babylonians to be here. We should realize they're a real, present, serious threat to our spiritual lives, kind of at all times. The love of controlling people from the love of self is not some distant hypothetical. It's one of the biggest threats to every single person's spiritual life. Another prophet of the Lord, the prophet Jeremiah, really tried hard to convince people that Babylon was coming to destroy them and take them into captivity, and that they should repent and start following Jehovah again and not worshiping other gods and not mistreating people. But people mocked him and said it's going to be peaceful, it's going to be fine. They persecuted him, they put him in stocks, they did all sorts of bad things to him. And they said, because we have the temple and we have all these good things, God loves us, it's all going to be great. And then even when Babylon had arrived, they still did not listen to what Jeremiah said to them about how they should interact with the Babylonians. So the Lord our God is warning us in his word to take the threat of the Babylonians seriously. We need to be on the lookout for the selfish love of control coming into our hearts. Now, part of what makes this tricky, though, is that not all desire to have influence on other people is selfish. One passage says this: dominion belonging to love towards the neighbor nevertheless exists, even in kingdoms, among those who are wise on account of their belief in and love to God, for these love their neighbor. Dominion belonging to love toward the neighbor nevertheless exists, even in kingdoms, even in countries. There are people who love to have influence for the sake of good things. So how do we tell the difference? How can we tell if we're wanting to influence other people for good or if we're trying to control other people for our own selfish reasons? It's awfully difficult. As a parent, trying to be a good new church parent, raising our kids to know about the Lord's word and what it teaches. As new church teachers, trying to teach the kids and keep them in line a little bit. When do we use stuff from the Lord's word, and when is that an abuse of things from the Lord's word? Well, here's a passage that can help us. Divine Providence 2:15. A person can recognize the difference between the two loves with difficulty, because a person does not know whether they are led by the devil or by the Lord. One who is led by the devil performs useful services for the sake of themselves and the world, whereas one who is led by the Lord performs useful services for the sake of the Lord and heaven. And all those perform useful services from the Lord who refrain from evils as being sins, whereas all those perform useful services from the devil who do not refrain from evils as sins. By this and nothing else is the difference recognized. In outward form, the two appear alike, but in their inward form, they are totally unalike. So that's helpful. If we're treating the people around us badly, breaking the Ten Commandments, and that's a pretty good sign that the Babylonians have taken us captive. But if we're working hard not to hurt other people, not to take their things, not to get revenge against them, not mislead them, then that's a good sign that hopefully we're on the right track, even if the interactions are still difficult and we're still a little bit puzzled about how we should handle these things. If we're not trying to hurt people and we're not breaking the commandments, we're shunning evils, then we might be okay. And even if we have done some of those bad things, we have been manipulating people a little bit, we have been trying to control them, we can still turn back to the Lord. In the book of Revelation, an angel cries out, "Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen." And then another voice comes from heaven and says, "Come out of her, my people, so that you do not become partakers of her sins, and so that you do not receive of her plagues." Even when we've been taken away captive by the Babylonians, the Lord can still bring us back to the promised land, away from Babylon. Now, to wrap up, from the beginning of this series of sermons about spiritual enemies and all the way through it, the pattern has been the same. When the people stopped following the Lord and started committing a certain kind of evil, then an enemy that represented that particular evil would come and attack them. Jehoiakim and his people and their fathers before them and their fathers before them were conquered by the Babylonians, who dominated them and took and misused their religious treasures. And that was because Jehoiakim and his fathers and the people before him had dominated people and misused the religious things for bad purposes. And that's why the Babylonians showed up. But it didn't have to be that way for Jehoiakim and his people. And it doesn't have to be that way for us. Thanks to the Lord and his word, we can know our spiritual enemies. We can understand their tricks and how they can lead us astray. We can understand the drastic harm that they have caused and will cause in our lives if we let them. And we can know that however strong our spiritual enemies may be, the Lord is even stronger. He can defeat even the biggest final big bad guy. One final passage says that people who are prompted by a love of ruling stemming from a love of self love nothing more than to lead themselves, and they want only themselves to rule. But people who are prompted by love toward the Lord love nothing more than to be led by the Lord, and they want the Lord alone to rule. May we all love the Lord to be in charge and want him alone to rule in our lives, so that he can keep us all safe from our spiritual enemies, all of them, and so that we can live in his kingdom, because his kingdom shall be forever and ever. Amen.